time after this. Next presenter is going to be Kristen Meehan, and she's a senior project engineer. She's going to talk to you about water service line material inventories. And I would say Kristen is our in-house expert on the regulation. She's really dug into not only this regulation, the Lead Service Line Replacement Notification Act, but also lead and copper rule. She is my right-hand person when I'm getting ready to do a presentation, and certainly knows a ton about this material. So I'm sure you're going to learn a lot related to inventories. And then if you have any other detailed questions, she'll be able to help you out with those.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. So I will be going through the details of the water service line material inventory specifically required under the new act. So for our agenda, we're going to start with a brief background on material inventories in Illinois. Then we'll go through the details of the new act requirements. I'll also take you through an example inventory so we can see how the communities work towards 100% non-lead. And we'll give you some tips for developing your material inventories, and I'll end with a couple of closing remarks. So this is a schematic you're probably all very familiar with, your typical water service line from main to meter. It's important to understand that under the new act, the water service line is classified as a whole. So it goes from the water main to the internal building plumbing, either 18 inches or to the first shutoff valve, whichever is shorter. So this is regardless of public and private side ownership. You know, many communities split that ownership at the B box. You will be responsible for classifying and inventorying the water service lines as a whole, all the way to the house. This is a screenshot of your current IEPA material inventories that you're probably familiar with as well. It's our understanding that the initial inventories over the next couple of years will be very similar to these, with a few added requirements. And then here's a graph of the current materials in Illinois over the past 3 years as per the inventories. The key takeaway here is there's still about 21% unknown in the state of Illinois. So that's over 800,000 unidentified service lines that will need to be identified before 2024. So now let's get into the details of the new act requirements. The act starts off with some key dates. So in April of next year, 2022, we'll need to develop an initial material inventory. And in 2023, the next year, you'll submit an updated material inventory. And then finally, in April of 2024, you'll submit your complete material inventory. So the key takeaway here is that it will identify all the materials in your distribution system. And some of the details of the inventory requirements. First of all, your total number of services. This is a number that you likely already have and are very familiar with. Second, you're identifying the materials of construction within your distribution system. So this includes on both the public and the private side. It's not clear if you'll need to break out those numbers on public and private side, but we will show you how keeping track of those numbers will benefit you, moving forward. You'll also need to keep track of the number of suspected lead service lines you've identified since you submitted your last material inventory. And then finally, the number of suspected or known lead service lines that were replaced since your last inventory. So as you can see here, a lot of tabulating and keeping track of the data that you are identifying. The Act also lays out some considerations to think about when completing your inventories. So the first consideration would be prioritizing high-risk areas and facilities. These would be schools, parks, hospitals, clinics, things of that nature, and prioritizing those inspections first. You'll want to review any historical documentation that you already have. This could be paper atlases, service line cards, as-built drawings, local plumbing code changes, stuff like that. Third, you'll want to visually inspect these service lines anytime you're available. So this might be during regular distribution system maintenance, emergency repairs, things like that. And then fourth, a really helpful one that we've seen is identifying a lead time period in your community. So this would be a year or time period when you know that lead service lines are being installed in your distribution system and kind of establishing that cutoff date. And we'll give you some examples of communities that have done that. And then finally, discussing lead service line replacement with all of your staff. And this includes plumbers, contractors, anyone who's involved in lead service line replacements in your community has potentially valuable information to bring to this process. And then the Act has a couple of miscellaneous requirements. First of all, documenting people who will not grant access to their house. This will be kind of a theme throughout the Act. This is a number that you will just report back to the Department of Public Health. Second, notifying the owner and the building occupants within 15 days of identifying a lead service line. You'll also post your material inventory on your website. Alternatively, you can have the Department of Public Health post it for you. You also have no requirement to report on service lines that are disconnected from your distribution system. And there's no requirement to excavate service lines for the sole purpose of inventorying. So with that, let's look at an example community. This is entirely hypothetical, and I kept it pretty simple as far as getting through the numbers. So this example community has about 5,000 total service lines as of their 2023 inventory. They have about 1,400 unknown initially, and their known materials can include copper, lead, galvanized, both downstream of lead and not downstream of lead, and plastic. And Tim's presentation will get into the lead service line replacement rates, and Jeff's presentation touched on it a little bit too. But this community would be at a 5% replacement rate, which would give them a total timeline of completion for 20 years. So this first year is 2023, their initial inventory. As you can see, we still have those 1,400 unknown service lines that moving into 2024 will need to be identified. So those have either been assumed to be lead, or maybe some of them could have been ruled out as copper. The key takeaway here is those unknowns were eliminated. And I should note that this example assumes that no new service lines were added to the distribution system in the past year, which is probably not the case for most communities. And it also assumes that no lead service line replacements took place. So this is a couple years down the line in 2028. So this would be 1 year after your lead service line replacements start per the Act. We can see that the community has replaced 90 lead service lines. That's part of their 5% replacement rate. And the community is working towards more lead service line replacements. This is the year 2038, so 10 years of lead service line replacements for a minimum total of 900 lead service lines replaced. These can be lead or galvanized downstream of lead. There's currently no requirement to prioritize one of those two options. And then finally, 20 years down the line in 2048, we can see that the community has eliminated all lead service lines. They've all been identified as copper, maybe plastic, even some galvanized that were proven to not be downstream of lead at any point. And we are at 100% lead. So with that, we'll give you some tips for developing your material inventory. Important to think about before you start, what are the goals of this material inventory? While it is a requirement, it can also be a very valuable tool for a number of activities down the line. It's certainly going to come into play with your lead service line replacement plan. And Tim will talk about that in his presentation. It's also a good tool for budgeting, seeing how many of these lead service lines you will need to replace. Mike's presentation will talk about how this information is very valuable during design and construction. Most contractors like to have this information as part of the bid docs and the project manuals. Like I said, you'll need to post this information on your website, so it will be public information, and it's a great opportunity to inform your residents and keep them engaged. And then it's also important for monitoring your compliance and tracking your progress. So many communities choose to use an Esri database pictured here. It's great for interacting with contractors and clients and customers who can, see what their materials are on the screen. So we've identified a couple of building blocks for building your material inventory. The first step would be historical analysis. So looking through your documentation that you already have, maybe some paper atlases, property data, plumbing code changes, things of that nature. Second step would be supplemented historical analysis. So looking at any recent building permits, meter changeout programs, stuff like that. And then step 3 is getting into individual inspections. You could do homeowner outreach, and I'll give you some examples of communities that are actually having the homeowners do a lot of these inspections, as well as having your staff follow up and confirming those results. And then the final step would be ongoing data collection. This might look different for a number of communities based on, your different needs and what you have, but really just noting materials at any point available. So now I'll give you some examples of communities that are kind of exhibiting these building blocks. The first up is Elgin. So this is a map of their distribution system and parcels color-coded by year. Elgin identified a date of about the mid-60s when they stopped installing lead service lines. So the yellow parcels you see were built before 1960, so most likely lead. The orange parcels were built between 1960 and 1987, so may or may not be lead depending on the year that they were built. And then green is everything built after 1987, so we can rule out those homes as non-lead. The key takeaway here is that by establishing that date, you can make really great assumptions and rule out a lot of homes off the bat. Our next example is the city of Evanston. So pictured here are their historical lateral cards from when the public side materials were installed. So we can see that this lateral card does specify the public side as lead. And from there, the city developed a private side methodology for identifying the private side. And this is based on the year of the water main installation, the city side material, and then the approximate year that the private side service was installed. And from there, they were able to identify the private side material. And then in addition to that, a good example of supplemental historical analysis for Evanston, they also include the materials on their inspection checklists for meter changeout programs. So as we can see here, the inspector went through this meter changeout inspection and did specify that the service is lead. And then the city takes all of this data and compiles it into their own database and posts their GIS map online. So contractors and homeowners can go click on their parcels and see both the public and private side materials. All right, another example of individual inspections is the city of Rockford. So this is a screenshot of their instructions posted on their website. Homeowners are kind of walked through instructions for identifying their material with different photos and different testing methods. And then at the end of these instructions, the homeowner is able to input their findings into the website, and that information goes back to the city. The city can either follow up if maybe the homeowner had questions or needs further assistance. Similarly, the city of Batavia also conducts homeowner surveys. So their process starts with postcards, which you see here. Those postcards have a QR code that the homeowner can scan on their phone and either take the survey on their phone or on the computer. Those survey responses are sent back to the city where it can be input into a database and integrated into their GIS. So here are a couple of screenshots from the survey. Not only does this survey capture the type of material, but the city also uses this as an opportunity to gather other information, such as where is the service located, information about the house. So does the house have a basement or is it on a slab? And then this is good information that's not necessarily required for the inventory, but really helpful down the line as the contractor and engineers start working towards those replacements. And then, like I said, all of this data is input into their database where the city can use this for a variety of different uses. The key takeaway here is they've gathered a lot of data just by using homeowners themselves. So not only is this really helpful, but you've saved your staff and your utility a lot of time and money by having the homeowner do a lot of this work up front. And then our last step would be ongoing data collection. So capturing this material data at every opportunity during water main replacements, emergency repairs, meter replacements, and even building inspections that aren't necessarily water related. If somebody's in that house, take that opportunity to grab a picture and document what kind of water service line is it. All right, so a couple of closing remarks, some lessons that we've learned. Start with a plan, really think about your goals and how this can be a very valuable tool for your utility. Explore all of your data sources. This might require you to get creative and talk to a lot of different people within your village or your city. And then utilize that public outreach to both engage your residents, but use them as a source of information as well. And this will be a key theme throughout today, start now, start early. It is going to take some time to develop these complete material inventories, but like I said, it's more than just a requirement. It can be a very valuable tool. And with that, does anyone have any questions?